Dr. Suriella walked down the hallway, gesturing animatedly as she talked. As the attending physician, one of her duties was working with that year's med students. Today was the first day of this year's crop of hopefuls. As always, Dr. Suriella started with a tour of the hospital facilities. The medical station wasn't as fancy as those in the Federation's inner systems of the Federation. Still, its location in Zada space made it the closest Type 1 trauma center to the war zone. It wasn't a posting for a medical student who wanted to just coast through their residency. Many broke at the stress put on them by the large number of casualties that even a small battle could bring in. It was very much a sink or swim kind of hospital. Any med student who survived their rotation here, as a Hatan raider almost made that a literal event, had no problem getting a position on a warship or other trauma center. The group had just finished touring the trauma intake facility. This station has 25 trauma rooms, just like the one I showed you, Dr. Suriella stated. On the slower days, they might handle most cases from when a patient first arrives until they are moved to another area of the hospital. Dr. Suriella stopped and turned to face the student. But when we get wounded from an accident or battle, they stabilize the patient and send them to surgery to finish the job. Once patients are fit to travel, they are immediately sent on one of the hospital transfer ships to other facilities to finish treatment and recovery. This allows us to treat more patients faster, with fewer patients lost while awaiting treatment. Dr. Suriella's voice took on a note of pride. Following the Battle of Jeridian 4, we treated 250,000 casualties in 48 hours with a 98% survival rate. The doctor's eyes took on a faraway look, remembering that chaotic day. The smells of blood, shit, and burnt flesh permeated her old lab coat so much that she had to throw it out. The cries of the wounded in a dozen languages, and the ominously still forms that had to be stacked in one of the hangar bays to make room for the next batch of wounded. It was 48 hours of barely contained chaos, and almost the entire staff dropped where they stood as the last patients were evacuated to other medical facilities. That event led to all 3,500 station personnel receiving a commendation in their file. "Dr. Suriella, are you okay?" one of the med students asked. "I'm sorry, I was lost in a memory," she replied, embarrassed at her loss of focus. They passed through a set of doors and down a long corridor with psychiatric patient rooms, currently empty on both sides until they came to a door that needed a code to open. "Med students don't get the code to this door. You're only allowed in if a senior physician accompanies you or one of the guards." She nodded to the 3 massive Yogath at the desk. "Escorts you in at a senior physician's request." She always enjoyed the slightly worried look that came over a new student's face when she gave that speech. Student physicians often had an exaggerated sense of their abilities at first, and they needed a reminder that even a medical facility could be dangerous. "Dr. Suriella, why is that area restricted?" one of the students asked. "This is the human psychiatric treatment area, or as my human colleagues call it, the psych ward," Suriella replied. All the med students began to chatter at once. If there were humans behind that door, then it was very dangerous. A healthy human was extremely dangerous in a fight, so just how much worse was one with mental problems? Dr. Suriella led the students down the hallway until they came to a desk with a human doctor and 2 more Yogath orderlies. Being a ward for humans, it explained why Yogath was at the door and inside. They were big enough to have at least a chance to detain an out-of-control human. Dr. Suriella addressed the human. "Dr. Saunders, how are you today?" Dr. Saunders looked up. "Well, hello there, Dr. Suriella. I'm doing well, and it's been a quiet day." He then scanned the faces of the med students before saying, "Fresh meat for the grinder." Dr. Suriella laughed and said, "Some of them might survive." Both doctors enjoyed the looks of alarm from the students. "How many patients do we still have?" Dr. Suriella inquired. 2. "We discharged PVT Lane this morning," he replied sadly. She asked, "And the sergeant's still here?" Dr. Saunders replied, "Yes, and no change," his voice sharing the same sad tone. After that, Dr. Saunders rose and walked to the door. He looked at the Yogath. "Yasil, you feel like taking a walk with me?" The Yogath just nodded his assent and opened the door. After all the others filed in, he shut and touched the keypad that secured the door. Dr. Saunders walked backward while explaining to the med students what each compartment was for. There were various forms of treatment rooms. Some just looked like a lounge with chairs and a couch. One had a room with soft walls that he called the rubber room, in case a patient needed a safe spot to lash out. The individual patients' rooms were somewhat Spartan, but still pleasant. Sound and video systems let them pick an environment that felt relaxing to them. Dr. Saunders explained, "With modern medicine, humanity has managed to eliminate most mental health issues via gene therapy, medical and psychological support. Occasionally, one slips through the system. There are a few mental illnesses that can pop up later in life, so facilities like this allow for diagnosis and the start of treatment. Once they are no longer a danger to self or others, they are sent back to one of our colonies." Gesturing to one of the rooms. "Being in a combat zone, we mainly get patients of psychic attacks or that need a short time away from the front." Nodding to Dr. Suriella, "The good doctor's people have been instrumental in expanding our ability to deal with psych issues that pop up. The Rathians' psychic abilities have been invaluable in dealing with the effects of psychic warfare." Dr. Suriella spoke up. "The humans are naturally resistant to most psionic abilities. This makes them immune to all but the strongest psionic attacks." Dr. Saunders continued, "Which is a blessing and a curse. It just means the attacks have to be that much more powerful to impact the average human mind. Fortunately for us, any negative impact of those assaults is usually short-term and we can finish treatment here." One of the med students raised a tentacle. "If they are resistant to psionics, then what kind of treatment is used?" Dr. Suriella smiled. "A very good question. Sometimes they just need time to talk and work through the issue. Others might require more support, either medications or low-level psychic treatments." At this reply, several students raised an appendage. "I thought you couldn't use psychic therapy on them." Dr. Suriella, "If you remember, I said resistant to most psionic abilities," she explained. "But those with minimal intrusion can be used indirectly." She continued, "For example, we cannot use our abilities to make them calm or to sleep, but we can project a feeling of calmness in the surrounding environment, such as the feeling of being in a peaceful place like a garden or a religious building." "That is what two of our patients are here for," Dr. Saunders replied. He stopped before an open door. "Morning, Mike. How did you sleep?" The students crowded behind the doctor for a better look. Inside was a human, tall, with pinkish skin, dark hair, and eyes. They were currently inspecting all the faces in the doorway. "I slept pretty good, Doc. Best in a long time." Upon seeing Dr. Suriella, he got a smile on his face. "Hey, Doc Suriella, how you been?" "Hello, Mike. I've been doing pretty good." She tossed her head to indicate the students before continuing. "Busy as always." "Do you mind if we discuss your case with these students? They are starting their rotation." Dr. Saunders inquired. The human merely shrugged his shoulders. "Sure." Dr. Saunders began to explain what post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is. He explained what could trigger it and the various symptoms. He nodded to Mike. In Mike's case, he only developed an acute case that has improved over the last few weeks. "You feel like sharing with them? It's fine if you're not ready." Dr. Suriella said. Mike's eyes took on a faraway look before he replied, "I'll give it a shot, Doc." He looked past her and noticed the Yogath standing behind them. "Hey, Yasil. Want to come stand by me?" The Yogath made his way into the room, exchanged a handshake with Mike, and stood behind him. At the look of apprehension on the med. "Students' faces," Mike explained. "One of my close battle buddies was a Yogath. He always had my back, so it makes me feel safer when Yasil is near when I talk about it." Mike looked at Dr. Saunders before asking, "Censored or uncensored version, Doc?" Dr. Suriella answered the question, "All of it. They'd better get used to it." Mike started, "I'm just a ground pounder, infantry if you've never heard the term, of 325th Legion Federation Army. We're nothing fancy. We don't get the glory like the flyboys, mech jockeys, or the tin cans. We usually get the crap end of the stick, but we get it done. We'd been on Ballast 3 for about 2 weeks, holding the hands of some engineers and techs salvaging a crashed Zith recon ship. Since we were behind our lines and the nearest Zith base was 10 light-years away, Command only sent 2 squads. Since we were behind our lines and the nearest Zith base was 10 light-years away, Command only sent 2 squads. So imagine our surprise when a Zith cruiser jumped out of FTL and landed right in our laps. Our transport ship was a floating wreck before they even knew what hit them." Mike continued, "Lucky for us, they wanted their ship and didn't just bombard us from orbit. They sent down a pair of dropships, so we pulled back to the wreck, using it for some cover while we sent the engineers and techs deeper into the ship. I don't know how many there were, but they had at least a 2. One advantage." We skirmished a bit as they approached the ship, but we had to fall back into the ship. A lucky, or I guess unlucky, shot took out the generator that had been powering our lights inside the ship. Have you ever been in a starship without power? It's darker than you can believe. We could have used our wrist light beams, but that just makes us an easier target. So we flipped down our low-light goggles to protect our eyes from any sudden bright flashes and set up an ambush. The goggles can also track our IFF signals and mark friendlies. One of the students raised a paw. What are IFF signals? Oh, right, you probably haven't dealt with them before. IFF means identify friend or foe. It's supposed to keep us from shooting friendlies, but doesn't always work. Mike explained. Where was I? Mike muttered to himself. That's right, in the ship. So we waited until the Zith was climbing through the hull breach we'd been using to access the ship. We could still see them with the limited light, but they didn't know we were there. Our first volley dropped 5 of them, and got another as they charged us. We had to fall back ever deeper into the ship. That's when it got ugly. Neither of us could see, so it was just random firing, grappling with an enemy you couldn't see and barely feel inside our armor. You'd try to stick a knife in one, only to hit the wrong body part, throw a punch or elbow and connect with a wall instead. Mike got quiet and his eyes looked past everyone until Yasil put a hand on his shoulder, and then Mike shuddered for a second. His eyes focused again and he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Dr. Saunders looked at Mike with concern in his eyes. Do we need to stop, Mike? He asked. We lost you for a second. Mike shook his head from side to side. It's okay, Doc, I can finish it. I don't know how long the fighting went on, Mike said, picking up where he left off. It felt like days in that chaos. And then some idiot dropped a grenade. No idea which side did it. The Zith I was fighting took the brunt of the explosion in its back, but it still threw me into a wall. I don't know how long I was out, but the alarm for a suit breach that got my attention. I couldn't even see where it was to patch it. In my panic, I forgot Ballast 3 had a breathable atmosphere. It was just very thin and cold. It wasn't long after I regained consciousness that lights turned on again, and I saw medics and other troops moving around the ship. Zith and Federation troops were still locked together in death. In some places, the bodies were so jumbled together you couldn't tell friend or foe. I saw one of the engineers being carried out on another stretcher. I found out later those crazy bastards picked up any kind of weapons they could and joined the fight. They held their ground and died where they stood. Not a single Zith got past them. I still visit that ship in my nightmares. Fighting in the pitch-black darkness, the alarm on my suit, and the gore spattered from floor to ceiling of the corridors. Blood in a half-dozen colors streaked the walls and pooled at the medics' feet as they carried me out. But I've been getting better with their help. I get some sleep now. Nodding his head toward the doctors, Dr. Suriella spoke up. Time to get back to the tour, and turned to walk down the corridor. Dr. Suriella? She turned back to the student who addressed her. You said there were 2? 2, Dr. Suriella replied, not understanding the question. You said there were still 2 patients in the ward and we only saw 1. Another student piped up. Dr. Saunders answered with sadness in his voice. You are correct. There is another here. His name is Sergeant William Danvers, he replied, while opening the door and leading them down the corridor. Instead of the door, he led them over to the nurse's station. He gestured to a pair of monitors. The screens showed an older, human male, sitting in a padded room with no furniture. What was visible of the man's arms were heavily scarred from a lifetime of combat. The man just stared at the wall opposite him, not moving a muscle. Dr. Saunders keyed the mic and spoke into it. How are you doing today, Sergeant Danvers? The man didn't react in any way. If you didn't see the screen displaying his vital signs, you'd think he was dead. Dr. Saunders let go of the button and turned to face the students. He rarely answers. He'll eat and drink if fed. We clean him up as needed. Another student asked, Why is he in the padded room? Is he dangerous? Dr. Saunders chuckled. Sergeant Danvers is one of the most dangerous humans in the military, but right now this is for his safety. Sometimes the flashbacks are particularly bad and he will reenact the fighting, so it's better for him and the furniture to keep the space bare. So what happened to him? The same student asked. Dr. Saunders replied, Sergeant Danvers and his unit were on Yellen 2 trying to clear the Zith out of the largest city. Urban warfare is particularly dangerous and stressful for our troops. Danger comes from all sides, top and bottom. Even clearing out an area doesn't mean it stays clear. Dr. Saunders continued, Sergeant Danvers' unit was taking fire from several buildings at a crossroads. They cleared the other two, and Sergeant Danvers threw a grenade into the 2ND floor room the Zith was firing from. Sergeant Danvers and a pair of his troopers charged up the stairs and into the room. Dr. Saunders sighed before continuing. The Zith was dead, but so was a Yeleni family. 2 parents and 3 offspring. The Zith had restrained them and left them in a corner of the room. Sergeant Danvers' grenade landed in the middle of the room and killed everyone. Some of his troopers reported he stumbled over to the family, dropped to his knees, and started sobbing while repeatedly saying, "I killed kids." He just kept saying it over and over, and then he completely shut down and was sent here. Dr. Suriella spoke up. Something you'll learn about humans is one of their greatest strengths is also one of their biggest weaknesses. Humans have a large capacity for empathy, more so than any other race we've encountered. This ability makes them capable of incredible acts of compassion and bravery. This is why humans are among the best combat medics in the Federation military, and why they make up a large portion of rescue and relief teams. Empathy has driven humans into many conflicts to assist and/or protect the weak. But Sergeant Danvers is an example of the other side of it. Sometimes that empathy overwhelms them. Sometimes it's just burnout and treated with some rest away from the field. Looking back at the monitor, Dr. Suriella continued, Mike mentioned how he returns to that ship in his nightmares. Sergeant Danvers never leaves his nightmare. War changes everyone, and they return different than they went in. But they still come home and leave the war in the past. Some, like Sergeant Danvers, can never leave the war, but refight it every day of their lives.